2. Woo!
Welcome to Authenticity Lab, a podcast where we celebrate reconnecting with our authentic selves. I'm Dr. Kelsey Miles. I'm a musician, songwriter, and also a chemistry professor. Each week I'll share a new story and break it down using none other than the scientific method to inspire you to live boldly, lead with curiosity, and help you become who you really are. Now, today's episode is part of a mini-series where I break down the scientific method, each one of the steps, and I help you apply it to something that is actually happening in your life right now. If you haven't watched episode 10, the episode where we talked about how do you do the first step, which is to find a good question, I encourage you to pause this episode and go back to episode 10 and give that a listen. You are going to need your question for this episode where we talk about the next steps. Step number 2, we're going to form a hypothesis. And by the end of today's episode, you are going to have a life experiment designed specifically for you and the question that you have. So let's get started. Step number 2 of the scientific method is to form a hypothesis. And this is just a fancy term for making an assumption of what you think might happen. This is a key part of this because this helps us design the experiment. One of the most important parts about a hypothesis is it needs to be something you can actually test to prove whether the hypothesis is true or false. Now, this is so much easier in science than it is in life. If you're anything like me, when you think about what could happen in a situation, you think about the worst case scenario. And often that's why we don't run the experiment. So I really encourage you to take some time to not just think about the worst case, but also think about the best case. In science, when we make a hypothesis about something, it's so much easier to consider, well, I'm going to run this experiment and it could work or not work. We can separate ourselves from this, which is really what we're trying to do with all of these life experiments. So to give ourselves the best chance of actually running it and actually getting the data we need. So go ahead and pull out that piece of paper where you wrote down the question from last week. You had a worry, we went through that meditation, and you came up with a question of something that you'd like to know more about. I'd like for you to spend a little bit of time about thinking about what your hypothesis could be. The key to writing down this hypothesis is it needs to be something you can test, all right? It needs to be something you can test. And hypotheses are typically based on past experience. So I'm going to encourage you to not just base it on past experience, also consider the best case scenario. So for example, if your question last week was, what would it look like if I shared my needs in a relationship? Maybe you were worried about a relationship and realized that that was really your question. Like, I don't share my needs. I wonder what it would look like. Your hypothesis that you might write down, and I encourage you to write a couple of them, like 2 to 3 different hypotheses of something that could happen, is your hypothesis for that could be, if I share my needs, I will be laughed at and they will walk away and think I'm crazy for asking. If I share my needs, here's a best case scenario, they might listen to me and be more than happy to do that. One that's kind of in the middle, they might not be sure about what I'm asking about and ask more questions. Another one is that they might get defensive. They might blame me for having my needs, something like that. So spend some time here. You can go and pause this episode and start to make some assumptions. Again, focusing not only on the worst case, but also the best case scenario for your question. Now that you have your hypothesis, let's go to step number 3 of the scientific method, which is to design your experiment. Now, in chemistry, we carefully design experiments that not only test our hypothesis and prove it to be true or false, but we also take special caution about the safety of our experiments. Now, we do this with things like lab coats and safety goggles, but we can also do this by developing an experiment that maybe doesn't use very dangerous chemicals, or we can do the reaction on a lower temperature. things like that, we really consider so that we can not only test our hypothesis, but also be safe doing it. And when we do these life experiments, we need to do the same. We not only need to test our hypothesis that we have, but we also need to do these life experiments in a really safe way. We don't need to go blow up our life or blow up a chemistry lab. We don't need to do that. So here's how we're going to design our experiment. First, we're going to define a clear action. In the chemistry lab, we're always thinking of experiments that test just one variable. So we're making very small changes to each experiment. So that way it's easier to collect the data and we can really start to see a trend. The same is true in your life. We're not going to take this huge action that then gives us all of this data that will be a lot for us to log through and kind of understand what just happened. We need to define something clear that's a manageable, reasonable step in the right direction to understanding what is true and false about our hypotheses. So in the example I gave you about the question of what would it look like if I voiced my needs in a relationship, a reasonable experiment, a defined action you could do and set up would be to have a conversation with someone that you have a relationship with. Ideally something low stakes or someone that you've already had decent conversations with. And let them know of a need of yours that they don't know about, you've never shared. Maybe it bothers you that they only text and you wish that they would call you sometimes. Whatever it is, think of something that is low stakes. Think of something that could get you some data on that question. Now, once you have that clear action defined, you're going to move on to assessing the risk of that. This might make you then redefine what you just said as the action. Take a moment and think about if you ran that experiment or if you did that action, what kind of risks are there? Are you really going out on the edge and potentially ruining a relationship? Is it someone that you kind of trust that maybe this is just a small step and isn't something huge? Really consider how big of a step you're taking, because we don't need to change tons of variables. We don't need to set your life on fire. We just need something small and actionable. Another way we can look at risk is to consider ways in which we can minimize the risk. So for example, if it is a tough conversation, can you have it in person rather than on the phone? I don't know. I think that would minimize the risk. Another one is, could you practice this conversation with someone you really trust first? Could you write it down and consider ways in which you could bring this up? Could you make sure the person is in a good mood before you bring this up? That might be another way you can minimize the risk. We do the same kind of stuff in chemistry where I remember doing reactions in a pharmaceutical company I worked at, and if I wasn't feeling that well on a specific day, there were some reactions I just wouldn't do because it really required a lot of my focus, and I just didn't want to do anything dangerous while I was not feeling that well. So these are ways we can minimize the risk. The next part of designing a great experiment is to think about what data you actually want to collect. It's good to think about this before you get into the experiment, because when you're in the experiment, you need to be observing. In the experiment, you're going to take the action and you need to know, I need to be listening. I need to be perhaps feeling how I'm feeling. In the example about voicing your needs in a relationship, maybe some of the data you would want to collect is, how do I feel before and after the conversation? It's important to think about what data you're going to collect, because this is what you're going to use to determine if your hypotheses are true or false. So take a look back at the hypotheses you wrote down. What data would you need to prove it correct or incorrect? What information? Is it just information about yourself and how you feel about it? Is it information about the other person? Is it information? Where is this information or data coming from? Because you're going to want to make sure you pay attention while you do that experiment, and you're going to want to make sure you track it. The last part, and probably the most important and the scariest part, is I need you to set a time frame. I need you to set a time frame for when you're going to run this experiment. It doesn't help you to design an experiment and not run it. Now, this is a really important point I want to bring up again. I brought it up in episode 10, but I want to remind you that you're being really courageous in doing this. I talked about the concept of once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you discovered a question you had about in your life, I'm really sorry I took you through that meditation and now you can't unsee it. There will be a time in which if you don't run this experiment that you are going to start to get uncomfortable and more uncomfortable with this question because it will linger. So I encourage you to spend some time right now, look at your calendar, look at that small actionable step and make a plan. Give yourself a deadline. Try and set up that conversation or whatever your actionable step is. Make sure it's small so that way it doesn't have to take like months and months for you to get the data. We're looking at something within the next couple of weeks. I think that would be a reasonable plan for most of your experiments. So go ahead and pause this video. I encourage you to go ahead and put it in your calendar. When are you going to do this experiment? Or when are you hoping to have this experiment done by? So there you have it. You've done step 2. You've formed a hypothesis. In step 3, we've designed our experiment. And now I need you to go run it. You're going to run your experiment in the timetable that you suggested. You did all of the risk assessment. You've thought about ways in which you can minimize the risk. You got this. Now, I want to remind you that this takes courage. I absolutely am so proud of you, and I hope that you're really proud of yourself too. At this point in time, though, you just wrote down all these assumptions about your question, and if you don't run the experiment, I'm really sorry, but it's going to really suck because you're stuck with assumptions. When we get stuck with assumptions, we're just running circles in our head. We create our own limitations. We don't know where we stand because we have no data about what we like and don't like. You have to run the experiment now. Otherwise, you're stuck with the assumptions that you have in your brain. At least we did bring in some best case scenario ones. Often we just hang around with the worst case scenario. All right, so you're going to run your experiment. You know what data you're looking for, and this is going to take you on to our next episode where I'm going to help you look at how we can collect the data and also analyze it. Before I close out this episode, I wanted to share something that one of you emailed me, and it's all about experiments, and I thought this was such a great time for me to share this awesome news. This email is from Iris, who sent this to me talking about episode 9, where I talk about accidental experiments. Hi, Kelsey. I've been listening to your podcast, and the accidental experiments reminded me of a recent story that you're welcome to share if you want. Just before my last birthday, I'd been feeling old and tired and kind of useless. I was struggling with the normal stresses of life and the world and some depression, like so many others. And I was feeling truly like I was a lazy lump of a waste of space. Oh, geez. The week before my birthday, I decided that something had to change. So I decided that week to just not watch TV for the week to see what would happen. And that week, I listened to music, podcasts, and started reading a book. I cleaned more often. My house was tidier. I even got some projects going that I had been thinking about for a while. And since that week, I finished 3 books, started crocheting again, finished lots of projects, and I also noticed that I'm going to bed at a more reasonable hour. I'm eating less junk, and I'm following through on more projects for the charity I volunteer for. Wow! Holy cow, Iris. I didn't realize I was running an experiment, but listening to your podcast, I came to that conclusion. And running this experiment is moving me toward being a healthier, happier me. Thank you, Iris. Oh, Iris, thank you so much for sharing this story with all of us. I think it's really interesting to consider the experiments we're already running in our lives. And the fact that now you're looking at it with intention of thinking about, well, I didn't realize I was running this experiment, but this is the data I collected. For me, when I started to switch my thought process around all the things happening in my life, and I looked at them as experiments, which is what I do as a chemist now, it helped me organize all the data more so that I have something I can always go back to. The idea about being intentional with any part of the method. In this case, you didn't know you were running an experiment, but you're being super intentional with collecting the data and drawing a conclusion and sharing your results. So I just want to thank you so much, one, for sharing that with all of us, giving us some tips too, because I think you're not the only one who probably needs to hear about maybe don't watch as much TV. It's so addicting. I actually don't own a TV because otherwise I'd watch too much of it. But you also are reminding us that we don't need to have it all figured out and that good things can come. And by being intentional and you sharing it, it's kind of reinforcing it for yourself and also for all of us. So thank you for sharing that, Iris. I appreciate that. Well, if you enjoyed this episode, I would love if you share this with someone that you know and invite them to be on this journey of running a life experiment. Heck, you guys can do it together. That would be so fun. None of us are doing this alone. If you feel like you are, I do encourage you, just like Iris, to share your story with me. I love hearing them. And if it's something I can share in the podcast that you think might also help someone else, I would absolutely love that. My email is kelsey@kelseymiles.com, and you can also join us at kelseymiles.com/thelab, THELAB. I'll put that in the descriptions of this episode. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of Authenticity Lab, where we went through steps 2 and 3 of the scientific method. You, my friend, have some homework. You've got an experiment you need to run. I am so proud of you for being so courageous to take these steps. I'll be back next week where we dive deeper into the next steps of the scientific method, which is to analyze your data and draw a conclusion. This is going to set you up for your next experiment. You're going to gain more clarity. You're going to start to build more pieces of that unshakable foundation so that you, my friend, can live boldly, lead a life of curiosity, and keep being your most amazing, authentic self.
Yeah, that house will always call you.